If you have eyes, ears, or any combination thereof, then surely you're up to date on Jimmy Kimmel, ABC, the FCC, and the vast crumbling of our Bill of Rights. But in this certified historical moment, maybe it's worth taking a look at how we got here, and maybe what might happen next. From Battleborn Progress, this is Battleborn Bytes. My name is Jacob. Let's enter the free speech zone. Well, that's still a thing we can do. We will get to the Jimmy Kimmel of it all later in this video, but I think it's important to start with context for all this because I feel like there's a lot of context that basic news coverage and maybe even a regular civics education is probably not going to cover. To go way, way back, let me just read the First Amendment real quick. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Pretty straightforward, in a 1700s kind of way. But first proposed by James Madison during the first Congress, it actually went through several revisions before we got to the version we know and love today. These revisions generally kind of shaped it like a bit of dough, you know? The individual language matters because, as you may have noticed, it's not actually that many sentences or even that many words. But originally, and I'll need to read this real quick, the people shall not be deprived or abridged of their right to speak, to write, or to publish their sentiments. And obviously we ended up with Congress shall make no law. The distinction between those two things is very important because over the rest of the early American period, it really is going to be about what Congress is doing more than anything else when we're talking about government censorship of free speech. So it doesn't take all that long for Congress to actually make a law that abridges free speech. Ooh, maybe like 9 years. Congratulations, everybody. We did it in under 10. This is the Sedition Act in 1798. This is part of the Alien in Sedition Acts, or the Intolerable Acts, as they've been called. Not by me, mostly by people who were dead. We've talked about these ones before, but just real quick, these were a series of laws passed by John Adams and the Federalists who controlled Congress, trying to prevent criticism of their administration during the quasi-war with France. Look, I'm just not going to get into it. The whole point is that they were worried about French propaganda undermining their prospects in the coming 1800 election, and they wanted the ability to deport their enemies or just jail them for speech they didn't like. This was extremely unpopular, all three of them. It's actually so unpopular that in 1800, the Federalists get absolutely demolished in the elections, and the Democratic Republicans who replaced them, led by Thomas Jefferson, just get rid of most of it, including the Sedition Acts. And here's a fun little quirk of history. This almost certainly would have been ruled unconstitutional, but the Supreme Court didn't give itself the ability to rule stuff as unconstitutional until 1803 in Marbury versus Madison, so 5 years after the Alien and Sedition Acts. Win trivia with that. Just hold that in your brain. But like I said, when we're looking at federal control of speech, we're really looking at acts of Congress. And it's not until World War I that we see the next serious threat to speech passed by Congress. That's right, for serious history buffs, you know it's the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. There's simply so much sedition. Allegedly. I am going to gloss over so much history. Why did World War I happen? Among the most complicated historical questions anyone could ask about anything. But why did the United States enter World War I? Well, in 1917, Woodrow Wilson's administration had sort of been getting more annoyed with Germany, but got turbo annoyed, one, because of unchecked German aggression in the North Atlantic with submarines and stuff, two, because of something called the Zimmermann Telegram, where the Germans basically tried to entice Mexico into declaring war on the United States with promises of German support to retake the land that they lost during the Mexican-American War. This made people in the United States very upset, and they go into World War I. Okay. Baseline achieved. Terrified of propaganda that the Central Powers would try and undermine the U.S. war effort, and echoing the Alien and Sedition Acts from a century prior, Congress and the Wilson White House used the Espionage and Sedition Acts to quash anti-war sentiment and, frankly, First Amendment protected speech from anti-war activists. They used the war as a pretext to muzzle this speech, threatening massive fines or decades of jail time. which is something they convicted people of, by the way, because that standard of the Espionage Act, believe it or not, upheld by the US Supreme Court in 1919. This is the case Schenck versus the United States. If you're a First Amendment buff, you've probably heard of this one. In this case, two socialists were distributing leaflets that claimed that the draft for World War I was unconstitutional under the 13th Amendment to the Constitution and urged people not to comply, peacefully, I might add. Lo and behold, both were convicted under the Espionage Act and sued their case all the way to the Supreme Court. Well, you'll never guess what the Supreme Court said. It said that when the US is at war, what are rights? What are rights really? More specifically, the Supreme Court, citing Congress's wartime powers, said that there was something called the clear and present danger test.
Jack, computer theft is a serious crime.
So are crimes against the Constitution.
Essentially, speech cannot be the subject of government restraint, right, saying you cannot say something, or government punishment, unless it brings about a clear and present danger of bringing about a substantial evil. But in more plain terms, this is the you can't falsely shout fire in a crowded theater case. But an interesting wrinkle emerges in another case from 1919, Abrams versus the United States. So we got to establish another quick historical timeline here. In October 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution happens in Russia, the Tsar is overthrown, and a civil war that's going to last for the next 5 years starts now. Crucially though, World War I still happening. Concerned that the German forces were going to take Russian arms, the Allied forces invade parts of Russia in order to seize those arms for themselves. Well, because of that invasion, Russian immigrants in the United States, as well as socialist sympathizers, issued a number of leaflets complaining about this. And when I say complaining, really what I mean is they called for a general strike to hamper the US war effort. Something clearly the US Espionage Act was designed to say, hey there, buddy, you can't say that. Here's the interesting thing. The Supreme Court rules 7-2 that actually no, the Espionage Act is cool and good, and this falls under the clear and present danger test. But Oliver Wendell Holmes, the guy who came up with the fire in a crowded theater thing, he says, no, this does not meet the clear and present danger test. What are we talking about? And he actually, in his dissents, writes this, that the best of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. That's right. The marketplace of ideas is here to defend 1919-era socialism. I love American history. I think what's more interesting is the context in which Holmes wrote that. This is in the middle of the first Red Scare. The Bolshevik Revolution happens in Russia, and immediately a bunch of people in America are like, is that gonna happen here? In the United States, socialist and anarchist groups had been active for years. The issue is, socialists in the late 1910s found themselves under increasing scrutiny, especially when some socialist groups turned violent. Look no further than the Italian anarchist group the Galleanists, who sent sticks of dynamites to more than 24 politicians in the United States. A list of people that, by the way, included Oliver Wendell Holmes. So with that defense of free speech, we start to see the groundwork laid for what's going to come over the next couple of decades, when slowly but surely the Supreme Court recognizes that maybe the federal government does sometimes infringe on people's free speech rights, and that's not constitutional. More than that, the Supreme Court also starts to apply First Amendment law to the states, not just the federal government. That was the case in Gitlow versus the United States, another socialist jailed by the Espionage Act. In particular, what's important here is the Supreme Court said, actually, national, federal First Amendment, that applies to all the states too. By the 1950s and 1960s, we start seeing more expansive free speech protections, especially for the press. In New York Times v. Sullivan, we get the libel standard of actual malice. You may have heard this one before. It's the idea that you can only be convicted of libel of a public figure if and only if you knew what you said was false or you acted with reckless disregard for the truth. And then again, in New York Times versus United States, the Supreme Court rejected an attempt by the Nixon White House to get the New York Times and the Washington Post to stop the publication of the Pentagon Papers. This is something called prior restraint, when the government steps in before you do speech to say, no, actually, not allowed to do that speech. Nixon had made the argument that the Pentagon Papers were key to national security, but the Supreme Court argued that you can't just wave your hands and say security and expect that to count if you're going to restrict First Amendment right. Then, of course, there is the actual media history part of all of this. I'm going to gloss over much of the beginning of American history, sort of pre-radio, because it's not really relevant to our discussion. But just real quick speed run. Really, we've only got like pamphlets and really dense newspapers in the late 1700s and early 1800s until the penny press is invented in the early 1830s. It was like the 1820s, and newspapers suddenly cost $1. But then tabloid journalism becomes a thing because who's reading a newspaper? It sort of democratizes who can read a newspaper because suddenly newspapers are cheap. And then it gets much easier to publish stuff in the late 1800s. Then we started getting the industrialization of printing presses and the ease to make the printing process earlier. Don't get me started on linotype machines. I love a linotype machine. And then in the 1890s, we actually started to add pictures to newspapers. That was a huge deal. Wow, we could only put engravings in newspapers before. Anyways, in the 1890s, there was this huge fight over yellow journalism and whether or not journalism was too sensational. This was also the origin of muckraking or investigative journalism. This was a new thing at the time. Look, the point is, even in the late 1800s, when newspapers were at the height of their sensationalism era, we'll call it, the federal government was not super in the business of restricting the speech of these outlets. It's not until we get to the invention of radio and its spread in the early 1900s that we start to see the federal government specifically take a more active role in policing the airwaves. This is because in the early days, there was functionally zero regulation of radio. This became a problem when amateur radio enthusiasts started sending fake orders to US naval vessels. Oopsie daisy. So Congress takes a first pass at regulating the radio in 1912, but not really anticipating that people would use the radio for more than pranking the US Navy. They have to take another crack at it in 1927. This is called the Radio Act of 1927. But more importantly, this is when we see the federal government finally give itself the power to create and deny broadcasting licenses for the very first time. Now, that comes with a carve-out that the newly created Federal Radio Commission wouldn't trample on free speech, with an exception for extremely offensive language.
They called them bad words, dirty, filthy, foul, vile, vulgar, coarse.
The United States always a land of contradictions, however, because one of the FRC's main jobs in the early days is to consolidate the number of radio stations because, like I said earlier, basically anyone could just have a radio station. The way it did this was by citing something called the public interest provision of its own charter. Remember that one for later, it might come up. So here's an example of what's not in the public interest. There was this radio station run by this doctor named John Romulus Brinkley. He promised sexual rejuvenation through the implantation through surgical means of goat testicle. So FRC brought down the banhammer on that one, although in a great little twist, he just went to Mexico to build an even larger radio tower and continue broadcasting. And you know, what's more American than that, I ask? But these fights carry on into the 1930s, when the FRC is reformed into what we now understand as the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. And frankly, one of the most interesting case studies of the FCC in free speech is the case of Charles E. Coughlin, better known to his followers at the time as Father Coughlin. Coughlin is a Catholic priest. In the mid-1920s, he starts a radio show that delivers Catholic masses for the first time over the radio. He also had apparently a very lovely voice, but it's like, I've heard better. I don't know. In 1932, Coughlin starts getting more into politics. He's a huge booster in 1932, for instance, of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But pretty quickly, he starts getting disillusioned with Roosevelt and New Deal politics, and by 1934, he's on the outs. And he starts getting very, very anti-Semitic. In like 1930s anti-Semitic. So just case in point, after Kristallnacht, Coughlin goes on the radio and says, actually, this only happened because Jews are all left-wing, and actually Christians were persecuted first under the USSR. Paraphrasing. At this point, just a year before the Nazi invasion of Poland that would trigger World War II, there is a national outcry in the United States over Coughlin's radio show. But in that moment, it wasn't the FCC that acted first. In fact, later that year, FDR said that radio, quote, should be maintained on an equality of freedom, which has been and is the keynote of the American press. No, instead, it was Coughlin's fellow broadcasters who brought down the axe. In 1939, the National Association of Broadcasters changed its ethics rules, essentially banning the sale of airtime to controversial figures. That included Coughlin and basically made it impossible for him to get a slot on the air. To be clear, that was controversial at the time. Plenty of people argue that hearing that speech was valuable because it let people know what they were up against. On the flip side, literal Nazis not known for their intellectual honesty and willingness to debate on even terms. So, not great. To put a bow on Coughlin, in 1940, the FBI raided his organization and arrested 17 Nazi saboteurs. So, as to be expected, I suppose. But back to the FCC, its involvement in the US media ecosystem has sort of always been a controversial blend of corporate interests, antitrust enforcement, and First Amendment law. For instance, NBC and CBS basically only exist because in the 1920s, under the FRC, they were allowed to gobble up more and more and more radio stations. In fact, ABC only exists because during FDR, they forced NBC to spin off one of its regional networks into a new network entirely. After World War II, the FCC starts putting increased scrutiny on these networks and the content they're putting out, both on radio and soon television too. This culminates in 1949 with the release of something called the Blue Book Report, where the FCC says outright if these stations are not serving the public interest, then they reserve the right to revoke licenses for these stations. This is also where we get the fairness doctrine from, the idea that the stations should give equal airtime to both sides of a controversial issue. But just hold in your mind that the fairness doctrine was repealed under Reagan, does not exist anymore. Cast it from your mind. For all the good that the fairness doctrine theoretically provided, what we ended up getting was a subservient press, one that, for instance, didn't question the government line on whether or not we were expanding military presence in Vietnam during the 1960s. More than that, we got a media environment that was obsessed with morality codes at every level, both under public and government backlash. From the 1930s all the way through the 1960s, the Hays Code in Hollywood policed the unholy trio of sex, vice, and violence in Hollywood. Under that moral code, though, in the late 1940s, we started to see the specter of McCarthyism. You see, there was a thing called the House Un-American Activities Committee. Sometimes Orwell wasn't on the nose enough. Now, HUAC, as it was called, hits 10 Hollywood screenwriters and directors with contempt of Congress charges because they refused to come before Congress, which begins the Hollywood blacklist, people who could not work in movies anymore because they were communist, allegedly. There were probably, some of them might have been communists. But it wasn't just Hollywood. Moral panics restricted what you could print in a comic book under the Comics Code Authority. In music, some radio stations actively sought to limit the spread of rock and roll, usually for segregationist and frankly racist reasons, echoing the same kinds of arguments that were leveled against jazz in the 1920s as the devil's music. All this to say, censorship can take many forms. I guess now's the time to check the news. Look at that, scene change. We had to wait for current events. So if we're talking about current events, of course we have to start with the fact that Kimmel brought up the killing of conservative activist Charlie Kirk on his show last week. The scope of this show, though, is not to interrogate exactly what Kimmel said, but rather to ask the question of whether or not it's a free speech issue because of what happened next. So, a quick timeline. Kimmel makes his remarks on his show on Monday, September 15th. He brings them up kind of in passing again on Tuesday because by then it had hit the Fox News circuit. By Wednesday, things are really blowing up in the conservative media sphere, and that's when FCC Chair Brendan Carr steps in. Speaking to an online right-wing podcaster, he says that Kimmel's comments are not only, quote, truly sick, but that he was eager to start enforcing the FCC's public interest provision again. Remember that from earlier? To that end, he also called on local affiliates to take action. And more specifically, he said that they needed to, quote, step up or face fines or revocations of their licenses by the FCC.
I mean, look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies can find ways to change conduct, to take action, frankly, on Kimmel, or, there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead.
Shortly after Carr's comments begin making the rounds online, Nexstar, one of the largest owners of ABC affiliates in the country, steps in and says that they're going to preempt Jimmy Kimmel's show with local news broadcasts. Sinclair, another one of the major owners of local TV stations in the country, and frankly an extremely conservative company based on their history, also steps in and says that they too will preempt Kimmel. Sinclair actually goes a step further too and demands that Kimmel actually donate to Charlie Kirk's organization, Turning Point USA. Within hours, there are media reports that Kimmel's show is suspended indefinitely. Asked for comment about all this by a CNN reporter, Brendan Carr, chair of the FCC, texts that reporter this GIF, which I think speaks for itself. Importantly, this also follows years of complaint by the now President of the United States, Donald Trump, that the media is routinely unfair to him, and that in particular, late-night comedy hosts are not just unfunny, but too mean to him and should all be canceled. For instance, on Air Force One this month, Trump told reporters, quote, "I've read someplace that the networks were 97% against me. Again, 97% negative, and yet I won, and easily. They give me only bad publicity and press. I mean, they're getting a license. I would think maybe their license should be taken away." I don't know how else you interpret that, frankly. But cue the backlash. Online searches for how to cancel Disney Plus spikes, Disney being the corporate owner of ABC, and Disney's share price begins to plummet. By this point, celebrities, comedians, and even other Republicans like Ted Cruz and Mitch McConnell step in and say, "Hey, whoa, isn't it kind of messed up that the FCC can just threaten comedians like we're in Goodfellas?"
That's right out of Goodfellas. That's right out of a mafioso coming into a bar going, "Nice bar you have here. It'd be a shame if something happened to it."
After a couple of days, Carr tries to change the subject. This Monday, he denied charges of government censorship and instead tried to say that Kimmel was taken off the air because of poor ratings, though this telling of events would have to ignore explicit statements made by Sinclair, Nexstar, the Walt Disney Corporation, as well as Carr and literally the President of the United States. But who's counting?
Easy way or the hard way?
Of course, Disney eventually backtracks, and Kimmel makes it back on the air on Tuesday night. Perhaps surprising no one, this is Kimmel's most watched show in literally months, with at least 11.4 million views on YouTube by the time I'm writing this, about 3 to 4 times the average number of views his monologues usually get. This is the classic Streisand effect. Try to keep people from looking at a certain thing, and suddenly people are really interested in why you're telling them that they can't look at the thing. But in this case, for our purposes, the thing is free speech.
As I was saying before I was interrupted.
Here's the thing, though. Both Nexstar and Sinclair have said that they're not going to air Kimmel even though Disney has brought him back. For now, both parent companies are preempting Kimmel coverage on local TV stations with local news instead. But it's unclear how long that's going to last. Not for nothing, it's probably also worth mentioning that Nexstar, who is at the heart of all this, is waiting on the FCC to approve a $6 billion merger with another media company, Tegna. Sinclair, not to be outdone, has joined Nexstar in petitioning the FCC to get rid of rules on TV station ownership that basically limit it to no more than 39% of the country. The goal here is to expand the reach and, frankly, the size of these super local TV conglomerates. And the only thing standing in their way right now is Trump's FCC. This is all coming at a time when the Trump administration has talked openly about criminalizing political opposition. Increasingly, there's also concerns about media consolidation under right-wing allies of President Trump. That includes the sale of CBS to the Ellison family, which moved quickly not only to cancel Stephen Colbert's Late Show, but also installed a right-wing think-tank dude with no news experience to be the news ombudsman at CBS News. This is to say nothing of the potential control of TikTok's algorithm by a consortium of Trump besties, including the Ellison family and the Murdoch family of Fox News fame. And not for nothing, after Kimmel's show, Trump kind of gave away the game on social media. For all the hand-wringing from Carr and people like Vice President J.D. Vance that this was never about free speech, but rather the free market kicking Jimmy Kimmel off the air, President Trump just kind of tweeted it out there. Posting to Truth Social, Trump said, quote, "Kimmel was another arm of the DNC and implied his show's existence was an illegal campaign contribution." To be clear, that is not how campaign contributions work. More importantly, he also said, and I quote, "I think we're going to test ABC out on this. Let's see how we do." All this to say, if it walks like censorship and quacks like censorship. But that does it for today's episode. If you like the show, be sure to like and subscribe so you're the first person to know when we upload a new episode. But until next time, my name is Jacob. This has been Battleborn Bites. We'll see you next week.